Welcome, everyone. That was so fun. My name is Dallas Taylor, and I tell stories about sound on the podcast 20,000 Hertz. And I also run a sound design company for advertising called De Facto Sound. I'm also the biggest Fallout fan in my life. No one really shares that level with me. And I've put in hundreds of hours into Fallout 3 and New Vegas. This was pre-kids. And I also had the opportunity to mix and sound design many of the Fallout New Vegas trailers. So this seems very serendipitous for me. This is my Disneyland right now. Very excited to bring the sound team onto the stage here. Let's start with supervising sound editor Sue Cahill. Next up, we have sound designer Daniel Coleman. We have dialogue and music re-recording mixer Keith Rogers. And sound effects re-recording mixer Steve Busino. All right. So my first question is for everyone, but I'll start with Sue. So when you were researching for this show, what did you glean from the video games?
Yeah, so just overall, looking at the theme of the show, I felt like the technology was a theme. Fallout takes place in the future, but it's also stuck in the 1950s in many ways. So just the general feeling of the show was not sci-fi world or digital. It was more in the analog and mechanical world. So that was just kind of an overall thought. And then, we have all these iconic sounds from the game, right, that all the gamers know. So anyone who plays the game knows what the vault sounds like and the sound of the Pip-Boy and Mr. Handy. So it was really important to incorporate these established sounds from the game into the series. So we were able to do that. We were able to use some sounds from the game, and we used that as our foundation. So that was kind of like our starting point, and just built and expanded from there.
Everybody was very concerned about being as true to the game and as respectful of the many, many years and many, many games. So the prompt that we got from Jonah Nolan on this was anything that existed from the video game, at least reference what the original was, if not copy it exactly. They gave us hours and hours of video game play to watch, and then Bethesda sent over a library of various different sound effects from the different games that we could pull from. But the way that video game sound works, a lot of the clips are tiny little slivers that then get looped over and over and over again because they don't know how long the player is going to stay in any one point. It doesn't really translate to the screen to use one sound over and over and over again. So they really worked as sort of inspiration and something to listen to and go, okay, that's something, I get where they're going with this. And then I could find little pieces of things. So like when Lucy comes out of the big gear vault door in episode 1, I found a creak from Vault 111 opening up their door that really sparked the ears, okay, I think a gamer would really hear that over and over and over again. And then as the vault door got to the end of the circle rotation, there's this great creak from Vault 76 that I layered in there as just okay, this is a game sound, and tie it all together.
Yeah, and I would add that Daniel and Sue did a great job of actually creating a color coding system for me on the sound effects side. So not only did we use the game sounds as the DNA for the show, but they built out intricate amounts of sound to expand upon that and give me control over all the details of it. But the color coding system was, one color was a game sound, one color was sounds that Daniel built, and another color was sounds that came from picture editorial. So I could quickly see when I was asked many, many times, what sounds, do we have sounds from the game in this event? And I could quickly see what was from the game, say, yes, we're playing this, this, and this, and we're building out with this, this, and this. So it was really, the organization was necessary to be able to handle that over and over again.
How about you, Keith? You glean from the video game.
Well, I think, being a dialogue and music mixer, I'm telling the story. And the main concept from the game that I think I was involved with was the music, and being able to really highlight these classic pieces of music, that were in the game, and make them play front and center in Atmos and make them sound great. And a lot of the pieces were old, classic from the 50s, pieces that had some degradation on them and things, but you have to be able to keep the quality of the original recordings, but also be able to play them full and mix them loud and do all the things we needed to do. So the music in this show was just a treat. I mean, besides the needle drops of all the classic songs, having Ramin's score was just amazing too. Just being able to use those two to blend all the transitions and to try to make it not noticeable that we're going between needle drops and score. So I guess for the game aspect was the biggest thing that I was focusing on was the music.
So I'd like to deconstruct two scenes in this episode that we saw. So the first one's going to be the Yao Guai scene. To refresh your memory, that is the mutated black bear that Maximus and Titus encounter, and Maximus holds back, and then we eventually find out that it's Michael Rappaport. And great scene. As I understand it, this was Daniel's audition to be on Fallout.
Yeah, very unusual circumstance. Only the second time I've ever had to audition for a sound design gig. When we got the show, Keith told them they should hire me as the sound designer, but given how incredibly important sound was going to be to the series, they wanted to work with somebody that they had worked with before. Completely understandable. And as I understand it, they actually worked with a few different sound designers that they knew in the early days, trying to get the tone of the show. They did hire me as a sound effects editor, but they hired somebody else who was a fabulous designer as the person who would do all of the creatures and the robots and the armors and stuff. But for whatever reason, they were unhappy with what they were getting. So then they started searching again. And then they reached out to Ben Cook, who was their sound designer on Westworld. And he said that they should hire me. And they still were gun shy about it. So on a Friday, they came over with the Yao Guai scene and the Gulper scene from 3, which is another huge creature. And the two of the post-producers came over. And they talked about all of the difficulties, the challenges they were having with these scenes, because it had to be so many different things, where this is an adventure show, but it's a comedy. This was, in the Yao Guai's case, this is a sick, irradiated bear that, should sound like it's struggling. But on the other hand, it's this monstrous beast, and we have to, feel the fear that Titus and Maximus are having in the cave when they see him. So there's all these different things, and what they were getting it worked for one of these elements, but not for another. And at the time, it sounded like they wanted to just sit behind me and watch me sound design, which wasn't going to happen. So I told them to go away and come back Monday morning. And I spent all day Saturday working on those two creatures. And on Monday, when they came back, I presented them with 5 completely different versions of each of these creatures. So with the Yaogwai, I had a sort of realistic one where it was all built off of bear sounds. I had a version that was more on the sickly, struggling version. I had a comedic version of it, well, sort of comedic version. And then I had a completely, no bears, completely monstrous, huge sound for it. And then one that, wove back and forth between all these different concepts. And the same thing with the Gulper, 5 different versions of it. And these are 2 post-producers. They're not the creators of the show, so they couldn't write off and say, that's the sound of the Yaogwai. But what they wanted was somebody who could be flexible and go in whatever direction they wanted to do and work extremely fast. So that was the key of getting the gig for the show. And in the end, with the Yaogwai, even after all the visual effects updates, it's about 90% what I did on that Saturday. The one going back and forth.
That same scene, there's so much stuff happening inside the suit vocally. It's so fun. Sue, tell me about that.
Yeah, so the treatment of the knight's voice was a big part of its character. So we used a few different plugins to create the sound that it was coming out of a speaker, out of a big metal suit. But we really had to treat each line individually based on the actor's performance. So, each line was unique and we had to treat it differently. And yeah, and then we actually were able to use this as a tool for the comedy. So in this scene with the Yaogwai, Knight Titus's voice is really big and booming and menacing, and Maximus is intimidated by him. And then you have the comedy, the reveal, when he takes off the helmet and he's just a little guy in a suit with a high voice. So, so that was a lot of fun. And then in other scenes when Maximus is in the suit, we might play it differently. We might pitch up his voice, and we thought that was funnier. So that was a big part of the character. But really, in that scene was an example of, I think, some of the challenges we faced balancing all these elements. The sound effects are huge, and the music is huge, and we're trying to, put lines of dialogue in between all that. And so that was a challenge that I feel like we really spent a lot of detail and time taking it shot by shot and making decisions. What's important here? What do we want to hear? Sometimes the music wins, sometimes the effects wins. And you guys can probably
that's a good point. That was really the first scene where we figured out that we're probably going to have the most success with this show in these busy, dense, whether it's a fight sequence or a loud sequence like that, if we really do go shot for shot and look at the picture and say what needs to win here. Is it a hit from the music? Is it a sound effect? Do we need to hear more of a line of dialogue, or can we crowd it a little bit? So that sort of became a formula for the way we would approach those intense scenes for the rest of the series, was shot by shot. What's the most important thing that we need to hear here? And that really, I think, gave us a leg up going forward.
Mm-hmm.
So moving on to the ghoul scene. The ghoul scene, the big shootout in Philly. There's so much stuff going on there. It's very dense. It's a very there's a lot of mixing. There's a lot of sound design going on in there. Tell me about. I had heard that Jonathan Nolan had you move some stuff around in the mix for storytelling.
Yeah, that scene. In that scene, there's a sequence where the dog runs out of the shop, attacks the ghoul, jumps on the ghoul, is on top of the ghoul. He takes out his knife, and we cut to Wilzig's face. We hear the dog whine, and then we cut inside to Lucy. And in our first playback with Jonah, the way that scene was originally sent over, even from picture editorial, was that dog whine was actually on the shot of Lucy turning her head and looking outside. It seemed to motivate her head tone or her head turn, excuse me. And Jonah stopped us there and asked to just move the dog whine a few frames earlier to the A side of that cut, so it's on the end of the shot of Wilzig's face. And what that simple move did was a real big moment for me personally, because his exact words were, okay, now that we see the dog, the ghoul, the knife, we hear the whine on Wilzig's face, that's the story. That is the arc of that story right there in those few seconds. And now the shot of Lucy turning is not so much motivated by what she's hearing, but she then looks around and decides to go out and confront the ghoul. So I realized in that moment, working with Jonah and realizing the level of storytelling that he is thinking about, I knew that we as a sound team, and more specifically myself, needed to approach everything in this show with that level of storytelling in mind. And it changed the way I work. And now, I think about it all the time, and I think about what is the arc of the story in this, not just this scene, but this shot or this sequence. And it was a really important moment for me.
Keith, tell me about when everything needs to be big. How do you make things actually, cut through? That's just the mixers, everything needs to be big. So how do you approach that?
Well, there's this show had that challenge throughout. I think, honestly, we have, dialogue is always the most important thing. You got to understand the dialogue. But I think there's so much dynamics in this show, and I think we were able to accomplish that with the creative input from everybody on the team. There's no one set method. We're looking at every scene by scene to figure out what should be telling the story best. And a lot of times it's deciding to let music lead, or it's let's take some music out here, or let's play music low, and just mixed type things. But to really get dynamics, sometimes it really is taking away things instead of just adding more. And I think we experimented a lot and did a lot of creative, trying scenes many different ways to see how they worked best. And sometimes that does mean, if it's a big scene, sometimes the effects don't need to be as big as you think they need to be, or vice versa with the music. I think everybody, like Ramin's music is so thematic and so great, but he leaves plenty of room for effects scenes. It's not like there weren't a lot of scenes where we're really fighting each other. Ramin's an amazing composer that way, where he understands the process, and he's like, okay, this is a gun scene. I'm gonna stay out of the way, and then so that lets us build crescendos, then hit the effects, come back with the music after the effects. So, it's a collaboration to get those things to happen. But I think that's just fortunate to have that level of talent, in a composer, and then for us to be able to, just kind of help and emphasize that, helps you get that a little bit more dynamics in the mix, because nobody wants to hear everything full blast all the time,
Yeah,
So.
and I would even say that Jonah was really generous with allowing us to go through and pull things out, even from the score at times. Sometimes we would drill down multiple levels, so the score may be made up of many, many stems, and we would go through sometimes and say, okay, there's high frequency in the score, but we also have in episode 4 there's a scene with Snip Snip trying to cut Lucy open with these metal saws, and there's a lot of high frequency information in the sound effects. We could pull some of the high end out of the score and leave room for the sound effects, and he was really willing to work with the different elements and peel layers back to make everything kind of shine when it needed to.
That shootout scene is so fundamentally rooted in this gunfire, and the ghoul's gun is so tasty. It's like so detailed. It's just exquisite when you talk about gunfire. So Daniel, tell me how that came to be.
It was a lengthy process. we actually did in a feature, we did a temp dub on this. And going back to Jonah's prompt about being true to the game as much as we could, the game has a couple of really cool gun sounds in it, like the junk jet, which is a wind-up mortar sound where you can put almost anything into it and it'll fire out. We have it at the end of episode 1. It shoots a baby's limb into somebody's chest. But aside from that and laser guns, which we don't have in the show, at least yet, all the rest of the sounds of the guns are really normal sounding guns. So we didn't have a specific direction on the Ghouls gun for that temp dub, so we used, I think it was a sawed-off shotgun sound, which worked perfectly fine. Right? But when we came back for the real dub after, lengthy conforms and all of that, we got there and on the stage, Jonah came up with this idea that the Ghouls gun should have this 3-part sequence where it fires out the cartridge impacts, and then it blows up. And it works really well on the first shot, and really well on the second shot, and really well in the slow-mos, and nowhere else. Well, maybe a couple of other places. But I went back to my studio, and I really tried to get that to work all the way through. But there's shots where we're on a tight close-up, and the ghoul is firing over and over again, and there's just not space for that 3-beat thing to work. So we got to the end of the dub, and nobody was really happy, because it really wasn't doing what Jonah wanted. It worked in those moments. We knew we were coming back when the final visual effects were done months later, so we sort of tabled and went, okay, fine, we'll come back to this. And then we had a long break between doing that dub and coming back for episode 3, and I went off to another project. And then Jonah decided that he wanted to play with the guns, and I wasn't available. So brought in Joe Frioli to work with him on it. And Joe's probably, thousands of sounds, shooting them at Jonah, trying to come up with something. And he finally came up with what is the ultimate homemade gun sound, which is the potato cannon, which has this great thunk to it, and it's not explosive. You really feel the cartridge or the potato coming out of it. And it has this low, just guttural sound to it, which was just perfect. So we took that and we, cut it back into all the sequence, and we kept those 3 beats. But one of the things that it really gave us going forward was the understanding that, okay, we didn't have to be literal about this is a sound from the game, put this in. It was, this is the concept of the game, and follow that. And so it really opened up the whole sound design scape for the rest of the show. So it was great.
So much of Fallout in this show is this clash between kind of violence and comedy, especially, and so much of this is happening in sound. So, Sue, can you tell me more about the use of sound to sell, or lack thereof, to sell a gag?
Yeah, well, there were times where we might drop out the music and really feature the sound effects, and that would enhance the comedy. So in this scene that you're talking about with the ghoul and Maximus fight scene, there's a moment where Maximus's foot falls through the wood deck and he gets stuck. And so we had the music crescendoing right up until that moment when it falls, and then we dropped out the music, and then you could just hear all the details of the sound effects. You just hear all the movement of the metal suit and the servos struggling, and then it was just funny. So that was a lot of fun. That change really affected the scene. And then I think there are moments where we might take sound effects out, and it was just as important. Thinking about episode 1 with the nukes, you had the 4 flashes of those bombs, and the last one being the biggest. And we were hearing a boom for each of those flashes. And then Jonah had the idea that on the last one, take it out. Okay. So we tried that, and then everyone just kind of went, whoa. I mean, it was so powerful. The absence of sound there, I think you felt all the goosebumps in the room. So that was just very impactful. The moments where you decide to take something out.
Yeah, and taking away sound from a mixing standpoint is another way to make something else louder. So in that same moment in episode 1, there's, as the first nuclear blast wave is approaching, we don't hear anything, and what came to us from Picture Editorial was a low rumble that crescendoed with all this low end energy to this blast wave where glass explodes and trees are breaking and everybody starts running for cover. But what we found was happening was the blast sounded great when it exploded the windows, but Jonah wanted to feel more, and it kept being about more energy and more of a rush and more low end. And when mixing for television, there are certain limitations that you run into as far as levels, and low end takes a lot of that energy up. So what we realized we needed to do was actually remove some of that low end just before the impact. So we pushed less of the low end rumble, we decreased that, and I actually dropped out all of the low end just for a frame or two right before the impact, and that just gave us the perceived effect of this explosion is so much louder, and you could feel the rush go by you. And that was another example of taking things away for more emotional impact.
So my final question is for Keith. What a time to be alive to be a mixer. I mean, look at all these speakers. And so I'd love to hear your thought process on Atmos. We certainly heard things going over our head, and we heard the very classic, quintessential, those type of things. But you think about that in a much deeper and more even subtle way, and I'd love to hear more about that.
Sure. Atmos is fantastic to mix in. It's the new challenge is now we have to deliver in Atmos 5.1 stereo, all usually within the same time frame. You might get a little more time now for Atmos, but it's become like the standard, and we love home Atmos for that Amazon has, and but really the key is Atmos can work in lots of different ways. We use it to have impact, to have things fly overhead, which is fun, and go from the surrounds or there's overhead speakers, so we can use that to literally have things fly overhead. But, and throughout the whole show, I'm continuously putting music in Atmos and spreading the music out. It's not just in the left, rights, or in the surrounds anymore. It's all over you. But you can really, you can overuse it also. The nice thing about Atmos is, I think some of the best things that play in Atmos are the quiet things, because that's when you actually can hear the difference. Because a lot of times when you have everything big music, big sound effects, lots of things yelling and screaming, it's hard to tell where it's all coming from. But you can really use it to create atmosphere. It's a good name for it, and really that's where you feel. Like there's a cool scene on the outside of the cave, and Steve did some great panning and Atmos in that, and that's one of my favorite things. You just hear little insects flying around and things like that, and I think that's one of the neat things that you can use Atmos for. But then also when you can utilize it to give you more impact of where things are coming from directionally. It's fantastic. It translates amazing. I've been a big fan since it's come out, and it really translates great to the 5.1 and to the stereo. So we actually mixed in theatrical Atmos also, so we had another version for this one. Atmos is a great tool, and I think it's obviously here to stay, and I think it enhances the experience, especially when you get to be in a room like this. And even at home, home Atmos now, there's a lot of great options for that, where you can hear some of the spread on, the overheads and stuff as well. Did I answer your question?
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming out. I want to thank Universal. I want to thank Amazon. Give it up for these four. This was an incredible, incredible job.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dallas.
Thanks, Dallas.